Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to those joining us from earlier in the day and from yesterday, and welcome to those who just tuned in as well. My name is Saba Azeem, and I work for PAX in the Protection of Civilians Department, and I work on human security in the context of Iraq. Before I introduce this session, I just want to go over some notes from our conference platform and some housekeeping items. First, I'd like to encourage everybody to visit the Meet and Greet tab and to see a list of all registered attendees. From here, you can search for individuals who are currently online and send them direct chat messages or even video requests. And you can meet them bilaterally and, of course, network and learn more from each other. If you've not already done so, I also encourage you to edit your own attendee profile, to add a photo, maybe update some details in the bio you do want people to see, and maybe edit those that you don't want visible to participants. We also invite you to post questions and answers throughout this session, and you can also do that anonymously. There will be a variety of opportunities for you to network with us and respond to our poll questions to provide us with feedback live, as well as on the event homepage throughout the event. And if you want to give us further feedback, we always encourage that through our email address. Just some additional housekeeping items as well. If you're encountering any technical difficulties during the conference, there's also a live help desk available. You can find the help desk in the drop-down menu on the conference homepage. We encourage you to post about the event as well on Twitter and also takeaways on social media and other platforms. If you do so via Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, or Instagram, we encourage you to use the following hashtag, PAX, POC 2020, and also to tag PAX POC and PAX for Peace, as well as participating organizations and the speakers themselves. Similarly, if you're capturing images or quotes, please attribute the information accordingly. Please also remember that all sessions are being recorded and will be posted publicly afterwards. Last but not the least, we would like to extend our thanks to the Department of Stabilization and Humanitarian Affairs at the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs for their generous support for PAX's protection of civilian work. We would also like to thank all of you in advance for attending, as well as our panelists and speakers throughout. Now to the session. I'm very grateful and very thankful to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, or SIPRI, especially their MENA and their West Africa Sahel teams who are joining us today. The panel that we are presenting in front of you aims to demonstrate the importance of local-level research and programming on human security for peace building. We're going to take the concept of human security in the broadest sense, some of the examples we also mentioned earlier during the day, and we will examine local perception and understanding in a number of case studies. In the West Africa Sahel, the panel will look at security, development, and governance challenges of the populations at the community level, and how these local perceptions of human security can be used to inform policy. In Iraq, the panel will examine the impact of the so-called Islamic State on the perceptions of security and the impact of these human security challenges on minorities in the Nineveh Plains. Whereas in Kirkuk, the panel will look at how the political and societal order influence behavior at the local level and how an understanding of these dynamics can help to bring peace at the local level. First of all, we will start off this session and discuss SIPRI's recent research from the Nineveh Plains. I welcome Dylan O'Driscoll, who's the Senior Researcher and Director at SIPRI's MENA Program. His work focuses on the drivers of conflict and pathways to peace in the MENA region. He's particularly interested in understanding people's behaviors in relation to acts of peace and conflict at the very everyday level. He was previously Associate Research Fellow at the Middle East Center of the London School of Economics and held the Conflict Research Fellowship at the Social Science Research Council in New York. Prior to joining SIPRI, he worked as a researcher and lecturer at the Humanitarian and Conflict Response Institute at the University of Manchester. Dylan also holds a PhD in ethnopolitics from Exeter. He has spent over 2 years working and conducting research firsthand in Iraq and has published widely, both in policy and academia circles, some of which you can see in the conference library tab on the event platform itself. Joining him, I welcome back Shivan from early in the afternoon, who joined SIPRI as a researcher this year. He is pursuing research on local peace and conflict in Iraq, as well as regional trends of political upheaval across the Middle East and Northern Africa region. Prior to joining SIPRI, Shivan was a specialist at the USIP, where he worked on drivers of social and political discord and barriers to return and resilience among the internally displaced persons. He's also lived in Honolulu, Hawaii before as part of his resident leadership fellowship at the East-West Center in the fall of 2016. He completed his MSc in the Politics of Middle East from the University of London in 2018. Over to you, Dylan and Shivan.
Thank you very much, Saba, and thank you, PAX, for having us. We're starting off the presentation today looking at Nineveh Plains. So this is based on kind of several projects that we have been conducting over the last few years. But today we're really going to focus on the post-Islamic State time. So we're looking at after 2017. So just to give a slight, I suppose, contextual kind of understanding of the area. So Nineveh Plains is, for those who don't know, and I'm sure many do, is rich in diversity. So many of the minorities live there. And our research in Nineveh mainly focuses on Yazidis, on Christians, all denominations, Turkmen, Kakai, and Shabaks. But we also look at how their interactions with other communities, both in the area and in the neighboring areas. The Nineveh Plains is one of the disputed territories. So this, or many parts of it are disputed between Baghdad and Erbil, or the Kurdistan Regional Government. And what this has meant is that the competition for ownership and control has negatively impacted the minorities, as you know, many of them complain that this competition for control has been at the cost of actual governance or actual delivery of services. So these are one of the dynamics that influences or impacts human security. But as many of you know, we've also had the rise of the Islamic State, and this is another kind of, I suppose, negative aspect in their taking over territory, targeting minorities, and many atrocities that have been really focused on the minorities in the Nineveh Plains. So as a result, not only have we had human destruction, but also destruction of the territory, of houses, of infrastructure, and so on. As a result, many of these groups actually became IDPs in other parts of Iraq, particularly the Kurdistan region. But also we have, they are slow to return. Although we have had many return, one of the issues that we have with returnees is that those who have returned, or rather those who have not returned, we have had a slight change of the demographics of the region. So if we look at it, taken together, we have this competition between Baghdad and Erbil, which negatively impacts human security. We've had the rise of the Islamic State and destruction, and the resulting, displacement of people that has again impacted this. This has also impacted the security dynamics, as we've had the rise of new militias and the return of certain groups over areas. We've seen competition within groups and between groups over control of the territory. So these dynamics all influence human security, and I think now I would pass on to Shivan, who's going to, I suppose, go into a little bit more details on the ground of how we see certain elements of human security impacted, and I will leave it there. So over to you, Shivan.
Thank you very much, Dylan. Well, to basically, in a nutshell, I will be talking about three aspects of basically throughout our engagement and our research work in Nineveh on basically understanding the human security element, especially in terms of human security concerns vis-a-vis or as related to these minority communities in the province. One of the elements, the concerns that are always brought up by community leaders and religious figures is basically the lack of or inability to practice religion and cultural practices. And this is basically, in a nutshell, is the religious practices such as pilgrimages and annual commemorations that are no longer held or attract critical mass of people because of feeling of insecurity among the returned people, or also because of restrictions on mobility within and also between different parts of the province. In fact, in some of the areas of the province, sometimes in a given district, you have different forces basically with alliances and belonging to the government of Iraq in Baghdad or the government of Kurdistan region in Erbil that are manning different parts or securing different parts of the district or certainly the province as well. And the importance of the practicing of these rights and cultures is basically they are occasions to basically celebrate and reinforce intergroup and intra-group cohesion, and some of which are also, for example, not only brings different aspects and different parts of one given community and minority group together, but also it brings notables and elders and participants from opposing or other religious and ethnic groups. And basically, these rights and occasions are important to reinforce intergroup solidarity. And it is very important because when we engage with the community leaders through interviews or through our field work, more often than not, they actually highlight that it is actually the political elite or the religious figures that are actually sowing the seeds of dissent or widening divisions between these various communities. Otherwise, on a community level, community members are actually getting along easily. And they are also indicating or pointing out to the slow or absent role of the government when it comes to the post-conflict reconstruction and restoration. And more or less, basically, the restoration and the reconstruction has been led by international actors, such as UN and other INGOs, with obviously guidance from the government. But it's a slow process and it's not inclusive. It doesn't have the buy-in from the community. And most importantly, as it relates to the religious practices or cultural aspects of these minority groups, they always point out to basically having received no help at all or little help from INGOs when it comes to rebuilding some of these religious structures that are important structures where these religious practices such as pilgrimages and annual commemorations are held. I'm also going to move to the second point, which is basically I briefly going to allude to, and as Dylan also mentioned it, which is the actual security or the hard security. Some of these areas in the Nineveh Plains are actually long disputed between the two governments in Erbil and in Baghdad, and that's why the community leaders of these minority groups are always share their misgivings when it comes to the general situation of security, where different security actors are in charge of different parts of the province without adequate or enough coordination and cooperation. And to be honest, sometimes these security actors, for example, might actually have competing political interests in the area. They can be national forces or paramilitary forces that are manning different checkpoints and different sectors within the province. And that's why it makes a lot of challenges when it comes to movement and mobility among these vulnerable communities. And also something that is actually in the post-conflict Iraq or the post-IS Nineveh that also comes up through our work and engagement is misconceptions and hate speech towards these groups. Actually, unfortunately, in a very ISIS fashion, like that are some of these communities are portrayed as infidels or devil worshippers by Salafi imams or extremist groups, and that basically it's reminiscent for them and also compounds their feeling of insecurity and threats from potential remnants of these groups. And something that is very important to think about that also comes up from our engagement is that minorities across the board, they actually complain from lack of civil, cultural, and political rights, and also genuine political representation, because in a country like Iraq, where concessional system was basically formalized after 2003, having access to political representation are seen as key to have a sense of belonging, but also representation to the country, and also to access to basically services, and also access to cultural and preserve these cultural rights. And my final point on that will be, as you have also alluded, Dylan, is the ongoing competition between the two governments over the internal boundaries or the disputed territories of Iraq. Nineveh Plains or parts of Nineveh Plains constitutes this these internal boundaries between Erbil and Baghdad, and that's why the two governments, according to our work, are, when they vie for influence, they basically support or incentivize different segments of the population, of the minority groups, basically to take sides of this conflict, to support their agenda. And that's why when they seek loyalty of these groups, basically they extend political support or financial benefits or enhanced services sometimes to different segments of these vulnerable groups. And that's why it widens the division within the group and also between the groups among the minorities. And basically, in a nutshell, the minority groups are now caught and fragmented across this Erbil and Baghdad and struggle. And to finalize, it is basically the minority groups were also actually the first to pay the price for the market security deterioration in the years preceding to the emergence of IS. And in the context of IS, the rise of IS, and how these minority groups were the first to basically pay the price and be targeted by the extremist groups for their beliefs and their views, most of these minority groups actually resorted to basically taking up arms in the name of community self-defense. And some of them actually mobilized or organized across ethno-sectarian and political lines. And also, given this dispute between Erbil and Baghdad, they receive military and political support from different governments, either in Erbil or in Baghdad. And that's why they use this political influence to further their gains and consolidate their gains, but also sometimes oppose the gains of the other communities. And to summarize, is actually these dynamics have all contributed to basically a lack of stability and stabilization in post-conflict and in post-IS. And that's why the complaints of lack of service delivery, sometimes lack of infrastructure development, hospitals and schools, even way before the pandemic took place, basically has compounded the feelings of marginalization and discrimination among these minority groups. And this all in all basically contributes to basically withholding or opening up opportunities for investment in these areas. And also for these communities, they do not foresee a long-term future and sense of belonging to the country, as we have seen with especially the Christians and the Yazidis. There is a complete flight among the Christians because there is a push and pull factor that they are leaving the country. The Yazidis, 3 years after the military defeat of IS, they remain in displacement because there are two local governments in the district of Sinjar where most of the Yazidis hail from. Each one is backed by a government and, of course, multiple security actors. And I'm going to stop there, and I am happy to respond to any questions that are coming my way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dylan and Shivan, for your very insightful findings, especially on inter and intra-group dynamics and how alliances have also shifted over time. It's very interesting to see how conflict has eroded the social capital around their cultural and religious practices and impacting their sense of identity. We've seen a lot of research coming from Iraq, usually on the humanitarian angle, where they're sort of highlighting the need for rebuilding and for rehabilitating physical infrastructure. And they're also, addressing these governance issues. But, equally important are these cultural practices that you just mentioned. Before we ask you questions, I'd now like to invite Virginie Baudais, who's a senior researcher and the deputy director of the SIPRI Sahel-West Africa Program. Prior to joining SIPRI in August last year, she also worked for 2 UN peacekeeping missions in Mali as Special Assistant to the Chief of Staff and in Côte d'Ivoire as Special Assistant to the UN Resident Coordinator. SIPRI Sahel-West Africa Program is currently conducting field researches and perception surveys in central Mali on security governance, socio-economic development indicators in the Liptako-Gourma region on humanitarian protection. Joining Virginie is Shourjya Deb, who's also a researcher in SIPRI Sahel-West Africa Program. He is responsible for research, design, sampling, monitoring data collection, data analysis, as well as data visualization. Shourjya takes a keen interest in descriptive and inferential statistics and in engaging with different tools of data management and visualization. He has previously worked as a graduate assistant at Rutgers University and has experience of fieldwork in urban slums and conflict areas in India. Over to you guys.
Thank you very much, Anna. Thank you very much for the invitation. So we will talk about the Sahel region. So we have the presentation. I don't see the... Yeah, okay. Thank you. So you can go to slide number 4 if you want. So we are working at the Sahel and West Africa team in the Sahel region, Central West Africa and Central Sahel. And which is so next slide, next one. Okay. Thank you. So the Central Sahel region is actually the most affected West African region, and following the collapse of the Libyan state, the Malian crisis that have aggravated the already fragile situation. And the crisis in the Sahel primarily builds on structural factors of fragility, so including weak states, fragile democracy, poverty, pre-existing inter-community tension. We can also question the political stability. We do not know if democratic institutions in the Sahel countries are able to resist to military pressure or various armed groups, or to the intercommunal tension and conflict, poverty, or key election like in Côte d'Ivoire or in Guinea or in Burkina Faso last week. And in Mali, for example, the recent coup showed that the regime has failed to respond to the profound discontent of the public opinion and the growing social unrest that are combined with strong religious movements, and that led to the overthrow of President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta. And the situation is also compounded by other situational factors that are associated with the emergence of armed or religious groups such as Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State of the Great Sahara that are operating in weak governed territories. And in some cases, these armed groups are protecting the population by providing services, basic social services, including the justice. And since 2001, international security forces have established in the Sahel region to combat terrorist organizations. But the performance and their action have also fueled mistrust between them, with the local population and central governments. And the rejection of international actors is very important. Next slide, please. At the country level, so we are currently working in Burkina Faso, in Niger, and in Mali. And we have some driver and impact that are a bit different among the three countries. For example, in Burkina Faso, the country is now exposed to the regional threat. And the first Hakim attacks in the country occurred 3 years after the outbreak of the crisis in Mali. But now the country is under constant pressure from armed groups. And despite military-led operation in 2019, the situation remained very complicated. There are also arbitrary arrests, execution by Burkina Faso armed forces that led to distrust between the central government and population. And the weak presence of the states provide a fertile ground for inter-community tension, religious tensions. And these pressures come also at a time when economic outlooks are not very good. The Niger also faces the current challenges experienced by the other states. But because of all connection, the situation in Mali has a direct impact on the situation on Niger stability. And the crisis in Mali led to a deterioration of the relation between communities, and there is a weakening of traditional authorities that is also a consequence of the growing influence of armed groups in the country. And there is a lot of displacement, refugees that also force the authorities to manage the local authority, but also to avoid the disruption of local dynamics and tension between local and foreign community. And in Mali, so since the signing of the Inter-Malian Peace Agreement in 2015, the Malian crisis has changed, leading to new conflict, to the multiplication of armed groups, and new affected regions. The conflict was first limited to the north, and now the central region of Ségou and Mopti are among the most affected. And the recent coup show how the Malian democracy is fragile and how profound is the rejection of the elite or of the political class. Next slide, please. Next. So following the continuing deterioration of the situation, as a consequence, state policies and other international projects or plans focus on security. So we know that protection of civilians is the primary responsibility of the states. And even if in the national security plan, for example, there is some component for development, but it's always relegated to the to the background. And the subjects of human security are people, and the goal is to protect the people from traditional threats, the military or armed groups, but also from non-traditional threats like poverty, disease, or natural resources. And of course, the state remains the central provider of security, but state security is not sufficient. It's not a sufficient condition for human welfare. Next slide, please. And so we are working with at the local level in Central Mali and in the Liptako-Gourma region, and with local research center, and we have developed a network of regional network. And to conduct the research, we have developed a mixed methodology that combines qualitative and quantitative research that can reflect a bottom-up approach. And the quantitative approach is based on perception survey, carried out by a network of trained facilitators, which are originated from the localities. And the qualitative research is based on focus group and academic studies when we want to explore interesting dynamics. And some projects are based on this methodology. And also, of course, we have interaction with national and regional stakeholders and donors. Next slide, please. And next. So I leave the floor to Shourjya.
Thank you so much. I'm going to talk a little bit about perception surveys. Perception surveys in general have been a very important tool for us in order to understand the civilians' point of view and the civilians' experience of security in areas under conflict. So in general, we have used perception surveys to produce information and knowledge and awareness about specific issues that civilians have been facing. We've been also been able to highlight experiences of civilians. In general, perception surveys are very centered around the civilian, and they are basically highlighting the point of opinion of the civilian. So they've become very popular over a period of time, and we've had the World Bank use such surveys as well. And the basic popularity of this particular perception surveys or perception surveys in general is basically based on two specific points. One of them being that they're able to extract and collect information about intangible issues. And secondly, they have been also been able to kind of bridge the barrier between objective and subjective conditions. Let me elaborate on that a little bit. For example, a very objective way of looking at security conditions in central Mali would be to look at positioning of national and international security forces, or even maybe look at number of security forces deployed. But that does give us an understanding of the security situation in Mali. But we would want to go ahead. What we would want to do is, from a civilian's point of view, understand the positioning of the troops. From a civilian's point of view, understand how effective they are. Do we have the exact number required of troops? Do we have the right position? More important, are they approachable? Are they available? So these are aspects which we can get to from a subjective angle, from a subjective perspective. And I think perception surveys here play a very important role in bridging the objective and subjective conditions. If we can go on to the next slide. So with our perception surveys, we've generally been able to produce information on basically produce information on the opinion on governmental and non-governmental interventions. But we've also managed to kind of balance out any asymmetries in information in terms of like what kind of information is the government giving out, and is there any radically different opinion that's on the field. So that's one thing that we've been able to do. These are all pros of perception surveys, but obviously there's a con. That being that when that is when perception surveys are basically being carried out, there's always a chance of responses which are biased by social desirability. When our facilitators are on the field, when they're asking questions, it is always a possibility that respondents give answers which they think are socially acceptable. Now, this is something that goes with all surveys, and this is where our networks, our partnerships with the local organizations become extremely important, because we are able to design questionnaires where we are basically taking an input from our partners, which are making sure that the questions are sequenced right, phrased right, and they are context and they are sensitive to the contexts, which may ensure that we can go ahead and do data triangulation, or even make sure that we have the right context sensibility. So putting these tools together, we can ensure that perception surveys are pretty much bulletproof, and they are a very effective tool going ahead in any sort of research which is in areas under conflict. I would yield the floor and let Virginie continue with the objectives.
Okay, so next slide and next one. So the objective of the research is first to monitor population needs and priority, and second to support policies and development program. In fact, so the evidence-based analyses are based on the development of indicators related to governance, security, justice, economic and social development, social cohesion, natural resources. And these indicators are based on local priority and perception. It allows, we can disaggregate, of course, all the data by age, sex, geographical origin, etc. And it's a way to monitor the evolution of the security and development condition over time. And the second objective is to support policy and development program. We want to support the development of stabilization program, and we want to help donors and international organizations to build strategies on concrete needs, and it's a way to identify the problems. It's a way to better understand what can be the strategy and the program, what they need to focus on. And it's also a way to maximize the local ownership. So next slide. So just quickly, on Central Mali, we are working, we have a sample of 1,800 households, but Shourjya will talk more about that. Next slide. For UNDP, we work on the 10 regions of Mali. And next slide, on the Liptako Gourma, we work on the border, on the region, on the bordering regions. So Shourjya will the sampling frame. Thanks.
Okay, the next slide, please. So one of the problems that we face when we work with in areas under conflict is the lack of census data. So sampling frameworks are comparatively easier to design when we are working in areas where census information is easily available. We can just look at the census information and draw out a representational sample. That is not possible. For example, in our case in Mali, the last census was in 2009. So for us to grab 2009 data and make population frameworks and sample frameworks now into 2020 is it's difficult. I mean, it's probably not accurate. So what we do is we use OCHA estimates. OCHA produces population estimates in Mali for every region, for every circle, and for every commune. So when we need to go on into a project, we make sure that we find out which areas need to be sampled, and we collect information, population estimates from the OCHA estimates. We put them together, and then once we have the total population required, we calculate our population sample from there. So we generally use a 95% population confidence interval, and with a 5% margin of error. in certain cases, when we design our sample, we generally have to talk to our partners here because you might have a specific commune which cannot be interviewed at a period of time, maybe due to unrest or maybe due to climate changes. In such cases, we go to and fro before we finally decide on a specific commune or circle. So this is mostly our sampling frames. This kind of applies to all the 3 countries that we have worked with, and we are heavily working with the OCHA estimates here. Going ahead, Virginie.
Thank you. So next slide. Next. So we have several stakeholders, so national government, local government, donors, international cooperation agencies. Next slide. The goal is to support change in policymakers' behavior, how research can support policies, how evidence-based research can influence policymakers and support shift in policy and advice, so to focus less on security, hard security, and to focus more on human security. We can see that stakeholders are more interested now in interacting with research and research center. And we also need to explain to affected community how data are used and the impact this has or can have on them. So the objective is to support agenda and to communicate also the research to policymakers and to other stakeholders. Next slide. We just talk about that. So the construction of the indicator. So we want to understand the threat. So we construct the indicator around economy, food, health, environment, community, political. Next slide. In some research findings, so we can see that the lack of legitimacy of the West African states hamper the capacity to provide security. And if they cannot provide security, population turn to armed groups or militia as security service provider. They can turn to NGO to support them, like in the AGR, but they also turn to armed groups, and they ask for public services, but the presence of public services does not mean good quality or functionality. So people are expecting the delivery of good public services, and they are expecting a lot from the states. Next slide. So that's the kind of disaggregation of graphs that we can provide to stakeholders. Next slide. For example, when we ask what are the main threats to the population in local Mali, despite the insecurity in the areas, the first threat is poverty and unemployment, and the second threat is the food insecurity. So we can also, next slide, we can also provide a recommendation, so in terms of delivery of public services, but on concrete human security measure, and also in terms of programs that can help the most vulnerable people. And we can, I think, thank you. Do you have something to add, Shourjya, or this is? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Virginie and Shourjya. It gives me a great deal to think about our own PAX's human security work in Iraq, especially how civilian perceptions vis-a-vis various security actors and this triangulation of various findings from these perception surveys proves to be a very powerful tool. And I can already see my data analyst looks very excited, especially when you're talking about data collection techniques and sampling frameworks. And last but not the least, I invite Amal Bourhous with Dylan, who will share their findings from us from Kirkuk. Amal is a research assistant at SIPRI's MENA program as well. Her research interests include the dynamics of identity politics, citizenship, and national building as they are related to peace and conflict, and the impact of securitization trends on state-society relations within the MENA region. Prior to joining SIPRI, Amal was a program coordinator at the Westminster Foundation for Democracy and visiting junior researcher at the Center for Strategic Studies in Amman, Jordan. And of course, you already know Dylan. Over to you, Amal and Dylan.
Thank you, Saba, and thanks again to our colleagues for the very interesting presentations. Now we are moving across to Kirkuk in Iraq, and also moving slightly away from perceptions. The research that we've done in Kirkuk focuses on the behavior of people, and we feel that this is there's an important interlinkage between understanding how behavior impacts people's interactions with communities and the perceptions of peace or security or and so on. Because we think in order to build the type of peace or security that the population desires, you also need to understand how they behave and how they interact, and this helps you can help policymakers in their interact or in their work in the region. So I suppose first of all, this research projects began. I should begin there. I've been working on Kirkuk for quite a long time. I think over 10 years, and in my kind of interactions with elites in Kirkuk, you kind of get this perception that there is no end to the conflict. There is no compromise. So when you come out of a meeting, you get this perception that there is just no hope. There is the issues that are on the table. There is no chance in any kind of compromise being met. And then you go and you see people in Kirkuk interacting, without any conflict at all, and you don't really see from the meeting, you don't see the reality of that when you go out and speak to local Kirkukis. So this is how I kind of began moving away from looking at elites and looking at the local levels and local interactions. So briefly, just to give a kind of context about Kirkuk for those of you who are not as familiar, it is also one of the disputed territories, and in Kirkuk we have Kurds, Arabs, and Turkmen competing for ownership. We also have Christians, but the level has I suppose, decreased significantly recently, and they do not have as much to say in the politics of Kirkuk. So as a disputed territory, we have this competition for governance, and we have this competition for who will control the provincial council, who will be the governor, etc. But since 2003, we could say that the Kurdish community has controlled Kirkuk, more specifically the PUK, has controlled Kirkuk. However, in 2017, when there was a referendum for independence in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, and they included Kirkuk in this referendum, we have seen the dynamics change in that as a response to the referendum, Baghdad sent the army into Kirkuk, took control of security, and also got rid of the Kurdish governor and replaced him. So we have seen a slight change in the dynamics since 2017. So this research is based on surveys that we have carried out. We chose the bazaar in Kirkuk as it is kind of a central meeting place for all communities, and we thought this would be a good place to understand the perceptions of the various communities, because we are focused on interactions between the communities. So the bazaar is a place where people interact. So I think the first surprising finding that came from our survey is that all communities surveyed perceive Kurds to have the most privilege in Kirkuk. And the reason I say this is surprising is because, as I just said, since 2017, they have lost control of security. They have lost control of the governorship. So I kind of myself connect this finding to perceptions of the future, because I think perceptions of the future really influence how people interact with each other. So when you speak to Kirkukis, there's a strong perception that Kurds will regain control of the governorship. Kurds will regain, the Kurdish security forces, the Peshmerga, will return to Kirkuk. So there is this perception that Kurds will regain control. And I think this influences behavior because people, they understand that once in the future, Kurds will control Kirkuk again. And this therefore limits or influences how they behave in their interactions. So this was the first surprising finding. But when we are looking at our research, we really look at how privilege impacts people's behavior. And as I said, people see Kurds to have the most privilege in Kirkuk. And this shows in our findings, because when we ask people, we're looking at acts of everyday peace and acts of everyday conflict. When we ask how people behave or interact with groups, Kurds were the least likely to avoid topics that may cause conflict. And they were the most likely to discuss a contentious topic, such as the political control of the city, when they are interacting with other communities or with other groups in Kirkuk. Kurds are also the most likely to confront someone, if they consider them to insult either them personally or their ethnic sectarian group. And they're also the least likely to avoid issues of conflict in their interactions with other communities. Now, I say all this, how privilege impacts behavior, but I think a really important point is that conflict avoidance is still the strongest action at the local level amongst all communities. So although privilege does impact behavior, and although Kurds are more likely to carry out acts that we see as everyday conflict, at the most part, everybody tries to interact with each other at the best possible way. So at the most part, people are trying to avoid conflict. So they alter their behavior to avoid conflict. And then when you look at this, and then you look at elites, where for the most part, people are trying to really get their point across, really trying to approaching it from a maximalist approach of we must control Kirkuk. These are our aims. This is what we're looking at. They just don't really connect. So at the everyday people at the everyday level, people are just trying to go about their lives. And the reason I think this is so important is from a policy point of view is there is far more chance to build peace at the local level in Kirkuk. So there's far more chance to focus on the interactions between communities than there is with elites. And if you look at many policy actors, there is a strong focus on trying to build peace at the elite level, where there is no chance of compromise, rather than the local level, where people are compromising without any other interactions. So now I'm going to pass you over to my colleague Amal, who's going to go a little bit more in depth into the intersectional lens and the intersectional, I suppose, how we can look at privilege through an intersectional lens. Sorry, over to you, Amal.
Yes, thank you, Dylan. And then taking over from Dylan, I'm going to zoom in a little bit and discuss how using an intersectional lens enables us to understand how people occupy and feel they can occupy space in the city of Kirkuk. And as Dylan mentioned, we focus mostly on the bazaar in the study because it's a place where people from different groups and ethno-sectarian groups, men and women, interact and meet each other and talk to each other. And the use of this intersectional lens as an analytical tool enables us, in a sense, to understand how different aspects of a person's identity, like gender, race and ethnicity and class and religion, etc., they affect lived experiences, because obviously, depending on who you are and your identity, dimensions of your identity, you kind of live through these experiences differently. And in this case, we're talking about gender and ethno-sectarian group affiliation. And this way you can see, for example, as Dylan mentioned, how there are structures of power and inequality and privilege that are hidden, in a sense, that you cannot see unless you use this intersectional lens, and you see that people experience different phenomena differently. And as Dylan also mentioned, we focus on the everyday because people meet in ordinary places with ordinary people. And that's where you can also see that acts of violence and symbolic violence or conflict and peace can also have a big significance. And sometimes they're often ignored. You focus on the elite level. But then back to our question on how the intersection of gender and ethno-sectarian identity affect the ways in which women, in particular, occupy space in the bazaar in Kirkuk. I'm going to talk about 3 different indicators. The first one, if you can have the slides, please. The first one is the freedom in the bazaar of Kirkuk, and how this is a function of gender dynamics. So basically, can I have the slide? Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so basically from these 2 graphs, this is a comparison between men and women. And you can see that for women's occupation of space is different than men's in terms of what they feel they are free to do while they are in the bazaar. So basically you can see that the women tend to feel less comfortable than men to express their opinions, to discuss with others in the bazaar. And they are also less likely to consider the bazaar as a space where they can socialize with others and relax and just be there, just linger and be there. However, still, like you can see that only in contrast to men, they feel, even though they feel less comfortable doing that, they also feel likely that they are equally likely in a sense to go to mixed areas where there are different ethnic groups, and they mix with these various ethno-sectarian groups. So basically, in general, the bazaar represents an intermediate space where the presence of women is not very problematic. So it's not that you have this gender roles that women are generally confined to the domestic space and the public space is just for men. But the bazaar is actually an intermediate. It's in between, because you have the presence of women is accepted because it has a kind of a priori justification that women are there to do something. However, you can see also that still, like if from the graphs, the women said they are free to walk around, and therefore it shows how it's still not, you still do not have a freedom for women to actually appropriate the space. So as long as they're walking, it's okay. But if you stop and linger, it's not okay. So for women, they don't feel that they're free to do that. But then in the next slide, we take it a little bit further and we add the ethno-sectarian dynamics. And we can see that the experiences of women are not monolithic or uniform as they might seem at first sight, because you have different experiences depending on your ethno-sectarian belonging. And you can see that Kurdish women, for example, tend to be or to feel that they are more free to relax and socialize in the bazaar in comparison to Sunni Arab women and Shia Arab women. So basically you can see the little arrows there. It's you can see how it's perceived differently, and Kurdish women like 31% in comparison to 9% and 15% only for Sunni and Shia women. So basically this points to an added dimension, which is the privilege associated with influence that Kurds are perceived or do have, as Dylan was mentioning before, that Kurdish women have this extra layer that they have privilege associated with their ethno-sectarian belonging. And then another indicator that I will be talking about is wearing identity signifiers. In the next slide, please. There, again, you can see a similar dynamic between men and women. The decision that of a person to wear or not to wear identity signifiers, you can see that in deeply divided societies such as Kirkuk, such public displays become even more charged with meaning and can be interpreted by others as an antagonistic attitude. And also symbols and identity signifiers are kind of a way to occupy space and to signal the presence as your presence in the space by asserting your ethno-sectarian identity. So in these two graphs, you can see that more than women, men are more likely to wear identity signifiers in the bazaar of Kirkuk every day, and also on special holidays. Whereas women are kind of do not do that as much. And from the surveys, you can see that women say that they never wear identity signifiers at all. So the percentage there is higher for women than for men. But if you add the ethno-sectarian dimension, we can see that Kurdish women are more likely to wear identity signifiers every day and on special holidays. And the data shows that they are more likely to do that in comparison to Sunni Arab and Shia Arab women. And Turkmen women, actually, they are somewhere in between these two poles. Also, Kurdish women, for example, are more likely to say that they never hide their identity in the bazaar. And this is in the data, we find that this is higher than men in general, but also higher than Turkmen men in particular, for example. And in the next slide. So the last indicator that I'm going to discuss is behavior in the bazaar. And here too, we can see that there are differences in the experiences depending on ethno-sectarian affiliation, and so between women themselves, among women. So women do not have a uniform experience. And you can see that they appropriate the space differently, and that they are more comfortable than men to discuss political and security situation in Kirkuk for Kurdish women. And women tend to avoid those sensitive discussions that are related to the future of the city, the political rule of the city, the future of Kirkuk, whether it's going to be taken over by Kurds again, or they kind of tend to avoid these discussions, and they take a discrete attitude. So they're not very visible in that sense. So they have a limited political presence in the public space in that regard. However, you can see that Kurdish women in particular, they have, in comparison to Sunni Arab women and to Shia Arab women and Turkmen women, they have a different experience, or they behave differently because they are more likely to engage in discussions about the political and security situation of Kirkuk and less likely to avoid these discussions, for example. So here you can these are just snapshots about and examples about how people occupy the bazaar, and women in particular, and how those dichotomic interpretations about what men do and what women do are not enough, that they need further nuance, and that if you use an intersectional lens, you can see that experiences in the everyday and in a place, ordinary, mundane places as the bazaar, is still hiding like different experiences, and that you have to understand how a person, depending on different aspects of their identity, is experiencing these phenomena such as war and peace and conflict, and that it gives you better understanding about also how to go about building peace and how to try to understand the civilians' experiences and ordinary people's experiences in the everyday. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Amal and Dylan. It's very fascinating to see how, privilege impacts people's everyday behavior and how that determines what topics they are more likely to discuss and what they're going to avoid altogether. And how also when you take an intersectional lens, results are changing a great deal on how these experiences within a commonplace location like a bazaar are completely hidden. I would now like to move to the question and answer session. The first question is from Michael Boyce to Dylan and Shivan. He's asking that many Iraqis from minority groups now also live outside Iraq. And we also know that how minority groups in diaspora can have a big influence on how peace and reconciliation processes are discussed or taken at home, back in the home country. Have you included any diaspora voices in your research or dialogue? And what role do you see these diasporas playing?
I can take that first if you, Shivan. So, we have engaged with diaspora communities, and we do engage with them on these issues. However, we really want to understand people who are most likely to return or people who are there at the moment, because they are the ones who this impacts the most. They are the ones living it. So without taking away from the diaspora's point of view, personally, we want to focus on the needs of the people who are returning or have returned. So we do research with diaspora, but we try to keep it separate, so that that our key understanding is. If we look at the purpose of the research, we're trying to look at how to build back and what areas of reconstruction need to be focused on by various policy actors. And for that, for us, the views of the communities that have already returned or who are going to return take priority. I don't know if you want to add anything, Shivan.
Well, thank you very much, Michael, for your question. Indeed, we have engaged with basically diaspora members of these minority communities. And one thing is for sure, and certainly that came up on the course of our work in Nineveh on the minority communities, is how actually even the community leaders point out to that we have a number of survivors and now actually activists that have emancipated and taken a position of power, that are speaking up for their community's rights, for the community's destitution and the plight. And that's a very, very welcome development by the community, and also for the international community and relevant actors. And to be precise, actually, we have engaged with these with the diaspora members, especially those who are actually now as kind of survivors of the conflict, that have assumed kind of even an ambassador role for their community. But the problem is when it comes to the point is when it comes to the diaspora members, it's basically it's about the likelihood whether they are going to be engaged with the context of their communities, and to how long are they actually willing to return to the country. I mean, not only the vulnerable communities and minority groups, but also if you open the floodgate, most of Iraqis are actually so desperate to leave the country and not go back to it. But that doesn't mean that they are not having agency or not utilizing the agency. They do, and they really have. I think the most aspect, which is maybe slightly outside the scope of the work that we have been doing, but certainly could be very important and imperative for the advocacy work, is basically the cultural rights, the language and identity rights of these communities. And also when it comes to having access to services such as health and education, but also having a genuine political representation at the subnational, national level, which are basically some of the long-term complaints and demands of these minority communities that actually precedes even the emergence of ISIS. So the answer is yes, we are engaging with them to the extent that possibility that is to the scope of our work, and of course to feed into programmatic works of other organizations such as advocacy organizations.
Thank you very much, Dylan and Shivan. I would like to move on to the second question, which is for Shourjya. And this is something I think a lot of us practitioners are very much interested in learning when you're doing such large-scale perception surveys. How does one effectively and cost-efficiently conduct these perception surveys, which are already, of course, very expensive, and then when you combine them with data triangulation, it kind of goes up. So do you have any insights for us?
Yeah, so in general, when it comes to perception surveys, I think the sad answer is the more the better, because the more data we have, the more accurate we are. But considering the circumstances that we generally work with, we have to account for not just in terms of expenditure, but also whether these areas are accessible or not, because there are multiple issues there. So two things generally that we try to keep in mind when we are deciding on a sampling frame is one, what kind of confidence interval should we be using? I mean, it's advisable that we not push our confidence interval to something around 99%. That would increase a huge. That would end up being a large number of respondents, which probably is not a good idea, not just in terms of expenses, but also in terms of access, but also making sure that we are representing all the necessary groups. So for example, two things that we definitely focus on is gender and age groups. So my assessment of the situation is that I would definitely go to census data if available. If not available, the next estimates possible. We use the OCHA estimates for Central Mali and look at what kind of population estimates that they have for gender and age, and try to ensure that we have that representation in our sampling framework. Because at the end of the day, the more the data we have, the better, but it is not possible. Hence, the best way to address that is to ensure that we have some degree of representation, or as high degree of representation as possible. In terms of, and one more additional comment on that, I think one thing that has been very useful for us as a team is having the necessary partner organizations on the ground, because while we can do the statistical part of it, the actual data collection is done by them. So we get a lot of information from them as to which parts are accessible. So we are not wasting money sending facilitators in areas where data cannot be collected in the first place. So these things are, this is also some sort of a triangulation where you work with your partners and also try to optimize on the statistical aspect of it. Thank you.
Thank you. We have another question for Dylan and Amal. Can you maybe explain a bit more about your methodology for your research in Kirkuk, and how generalizable are these findings, outside of the Kirkuk city or outside of the bazaar that you have studied for your research?
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, our focus is on Kirkuk city. So we're not looking. I suppose, the bazaar is utilized by communities throughout Kirkuk, but we are focusing on interactions in the city. So how people interact when they are in the city center. With the methodology, I mean, theoretically, we're looking at, we're looking at symbolic capital essentially, and we're looking at how this influences people's interactions. So we are trying to understand the role that privilege plays in people's interactions and how this influences their behavior. From this, we look at both everyday peace and everyday conflict. So everyday peace, we examine as, when people, alter their behavior to ensure that they are peaceful with communities. Everyday conflict is more antagonistic. But I think we mentioned some aspects of everyday conflict, but I think it's important to highlight that our focus is rather on these together. So it's not a single act. It's rather, many acts together that may, that come with privilege, that may antagonize communities and can, but doesn't necessarily, but can influence interactions between community. So, and going on our focus, so this research was carried out last year. We took a sample within the bazaar of just over 500 people. We again, there's no survey data for political reasons in Kirkuk, so we rather tried to match this to how we to election results. So we have focused on election results and tried to do a sample this way, and we have matched our sample to the election results. I think the one thing that I would point to with this is that these types of, we did this last year, these types of surveys need to be done often because dynamics change. We are in an ever-changing, we are looking at a conflict that is ever-changing, and the dynamics are constantly. So if we had done this survey before 2017, and the retake of Kirkuk by the central government, the results would be very different. If we're doing them now, I think they would be slightly different rather than significantly different. So the one thing is that with this type of research, it needs to be repeated often. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dylan. That's very important. That yes, in very dynamic situations, even though Iraq is a protracted crisis, it is ever changing, and how from 2003 onwards. Every few months, you can get new perceptions and new results. I have another question, again, for the Iraq team, or for the MENA team, rather. To what extent do you see the international community adapting to these changes in dynamics at the local level that you've just described for Iraq? And how do you adapt to these changes?
I can start again, and,
yeah, of
and
course.
then it's nobody else is volunteering. So yeah, I think if we're talking about this, it depends on which part of Iraq you're looking at, because I think in different areas there are different focuses. From an international perspective, I still think that the focus is too much on the elite level, and we have not really seen the kind of the move to a strong focus on the local, which we see as being more susceptible to building peace. So if you invested more at local peace building, we think the results would be better. However, as I said, I think the geographics is key, and we are seeing in Nineveh maybe a more focus, or in Nineveh Plains, on local levels of peace building. In Kirkuk, I still think there is a strong focus on elites, and I think it's a difference in conflict maybe, because there is in Nineveh, I suppose there is you're looking at the post-Islamic State order, and you're trying to reconstruct towards it, so that it maybe encourages a more local focus. Whereas in Kirkuk, I still think there is a focus on trying to get a grand peace agreement between political actors at a higher level, because that's something that gets more attention. Whereas if you speak to the elites in Kirkuk over a long period of time, you can realize that this is not something that is going to happen in the near future. So if you invested the same at the local level, you would have a better chance in improving the lives of everyday people, and ultimately this should be our goal. Well, in my opinion, at least. So short answer is I think it depends on geographically where you're focusing. I still think there needs to be a stronger focus throughout, even in Nineveh, on local aspects, because even there is still a focus on religious leaders and community leaders, rather than on improving interactions between people in their everyday lives. I don't know if you want to add anything, Shivan or Amal.
Yeah, I'm echoing your words, but echoing what Dylan has just said. There is actually, for example, we have seen one aspect of Nineveh Plains being the district of Sinjar, where basically most of the Yazidis hail from, despite basically the destruction of the community being targeted by ISIL, the complete destruction of the town, etc., etc. And of course, the community has now found, through its survivors, through its community leaders, through its young activists, a voice to champion for its rights and to attract attention locally and internationally for its plight. But then we have seen, once again, when it comes to basically normalization of the situation in the district, or the plans going about reconstruction and stabilization, reconciliation, or be it compensation, which is slow, and reconstruction remains slow. These voices, these local voices, community members' voices, are once again being ignored. And that's what basically the community is mostly complaining about, that once again, it's back to de facto, where basically relations or engagements, both nationally and internationally, focuses on the two governments of Erbil and Baghdad, or on the elite level. And more often than not, that these focuses on elite level does not necessarily reflect the aspirations and wills and the needs of the community members, or the communities that have basically remained in displacement for a long time. That was just an example to provide from our empirical work in Nineveh about the sorts of engagement in Iraq.
Just one last question as we're running out of time. I'm going to merge two. One's from Manuela, who's posing a question for Shivan, who's saying, conducting research with minority communities on sensitive topic requires a great deal of trust. Sorry, this was anonymous, so I'm going to merge it with Manuela's question. So how do you go about doing this practically, building trust with minorities? And second, what risk do you believe the marginalization of these minority groups in the post-IS era will pose for further polarization and violence perpetuation within Iraq? And Dylan, if you'd also like to comment on this.
Well, I suppose when it comes to basically the first question, it's very, very important that when you go in and you have to have quite a robust knowledge about the community, about their, for example, religious belief, and some of the pinnacles of what basically constitutes their faith and religious aspects. So you're not basically antagonizing or insulting their sacred beliefs and etc. And in when it comes to basically gaining trust and confidence, it's basically it's something that it doesn't come about within like one interaction or two. It's basically on an ongoing that you have worked with these communities over the years, and you have maintained that contact, you have maintained those relationships, but you also, not only on a personal level, but also you follow up the developments within the community and about the community. Like some of my engagements with these groups, for example, to remain, basically to keep anonymity, is with them, with the Kakai community or Ahli Haq. It's basically when I have brought up incidents of basically misconceptions about their faith, or incidents that basically the community faced, hate speech, or for example, their religious structures were desecrated, it was a cemetery. They were actually surprised in a positive way that I have followed up, and I follow for my personal interest, but also for my professional interest about the plight of this community, because this is basically to show that you are not only interested because of your work, but you're also interested outside of the scope of the work, and also because you care about these instances. So that's actually reinforcing the discourse that when it comes from them, that they complain about, for example, hate speech or being marginalized, being their religion and belief being taken for misconception, you basically give a solid example about that. So it's basically a work continuous. You remain interested. You, of course, have a rapporteur. And of course, you protect anonymity, because the problem is to have these communities and community leaders, sometimes religious figures, to open up. It's fundamental to preserve and protect their anonymity, to basically do no harm principles. We have a safeguarding principle in place here at SIPRI that we are using in all our research engagements and activities. We cannot disclose the people that we are engaging. We don't want to put them in harm's way. So that's the first question. And when it comes to Manuela's question, I'm trying to remember exactly what she was alluding to, but could you please remind me,
Yes.
Saba, about Manuela's question?
Yes, she's asking, what risk do you believe that the marginalization of minority groups in this post-IS era pose to further polarization and violence perpetuation in the country?
Yes, before I answer that, please, Dylan, feel welcome to add on both my answers to the both questions. I think the second question, the danger is very clear. I mean, these minority communities, especially the Yazidis and Christians, have been in protracted displacement for 5 years now, almost 5 years. The Yazidis, since the basically emergence of IS in Sinjar in August 2016, most of them have remained in displacement. And then again, the rebuilding process, the reconstruction process, compensation and justice have been very slow and still not complete. And a lot of observations can be said about them. So the danger could be basically continuous or complete flight of these communities from Iraq, or basically leaving the country altogether. And the other danger could be also like when these communities are not able to go back to their own original areas, it's basically their attachment and sense of belonging to Iraq that's going to be harmed and in danger, because some of their cultural practices is basically intrinsical to their attachment to the land and to their areas of origin where they have religious structures, but also the way of life that is only available in their original areas.
I just add quickly to the first question. I think for us, transparency is key. So when we begin the research, we have an outline of what it's about, what we are doing, and what are the aims. And this is we make sure that people understand before they're beginning. Then we have, we encourage them that anytime they want, they can pull out. So we're trying to build trust over a period of time. Following this, we don't just do research and disappear. This is a continuous engagement. So not only we make sure that people are understanding how the research is developing, we also bring findings back. So findings, if you engage in the research, you will also be kept in touch with our findings and how the research is building and who we are informing and how it will develop. So I think it's a longer process, but for us, transparency is key. And we have been building this over time. Thank you.
Oh, that's very good to know that, research is not being done because it's fascinating or for the sake of research, but you also take the findings back. And just to tie the entire day, we started off with the definition of human security. So one last question would be, would you argue that the concept of protection of civilians should also extend to the protection of cultural rights alongside sort of more traditional aspects of human security?
Who is that to?
Dylan, Shivan, both of you.
Because it's fundamental. As I said, it's their identity, cultural and religious rights to be free to basically exercise their beliefs and cultural rights. It's fundamental to, especially in the case of Iraq, to these minority groups' sense of belonging and attachment to the country.
I think we are talking about communities who have suffered a great deal, who have been targeted for their beliefs. So I think this is the key. So they have been targeted for these, so therefore, it absolutely connects to human security, and bringing it back is important. One, it shows that the country or the government at least respects their I suppose their culture, but also that things are changing. So I think it's important to bring back a sense of belonging from these communities, and any government action towards it demonstrates to these communities that their culture is being taken seriously, and the fact that they have been targeted for their cultural beliefs or their religious beliefs, this connects it to human security automatically. And for the longer term, we think it's important that these are brought back.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, this is all the time that we have for today. I'd like to thank all our speakers today, Shourjya, Virginie, Amal, Dylan, and Shivan, and of course also to our participants for engaging us in this very insightful conversation. I encourage you to reach out to the panelists as well as bilaterally to other participants of the conference and continue these discussions and also engage us on various social media accounts as well as on the conference page. Tomorrow, we will bring you more exciting and inspirational discussions as we discuss the reverberating effects that military operations can have on local civilians. And my colleague Wilbert here will share more details with you.
Thank you, Saba, for giving me the opportunity to do a short pitch for the day tomorrow after such an interesting day today. Tomorrow, as Saba already said, we'll talk the whole day about the concept of civilian harm. And more specifically, we'll look at the longer-term and reverberating effects of military violence on civilians. We've broken the day up into 3 parts tomorrow. In the morning, we'll look very specifically at a couple of case studies. We'll hear from Omar Mohammed, the founder of Mosul Eye, on his interpretations of what is now going on in Mosul 4 years after the biggest violence has stopped. But we'll also hear from Roos Boer, our colleague at PAX, about her research into civilian harm in Mosul, Raqqa, and Hawija. The second chunk tomorrow will be a slightly more academic approach to this topic. And we'll look at how you model pathways of harm. So how do you integrate into a model all the different strands, all the different types of harm, and how do you map all the different causes and effects in that? We'll have a presentation from the people of Frontlines Lab. And after that, we'll have responses from Wim Zwijnenburg and Alma Al-Osta. Finally, in the afternoon, we'll turn to the question, what is the military role and responsibility in all this? What should the military take on board in terms of recommendations from the day as we discuss it tomorrow? We'll have introductions from Beatrice Godefroy from Civic, but also from Petter Lindqvist from Nodefic. And after that, we'll have an interactive discussion to end the day with.
Thank you, Wilbert. I'm actually looking forward to tomorrow. I also hope all our participants can join in and enrich the discussion even more with their experiences. I once again thank all our panelists, speakers, audience members for participating with us all day. And I wish you a pleasant evening. We look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. Thank you.